Hello, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to present to you today. I'll be talking about some of my research on child sex tourism in Jamaica to think about how we frame sexual violence in trafficking discourses. Kendall and Gibson argue that how we frame social issues profoundly influences our understandings of them and how we think about them and how we talk about solutions. They argue framing involves more than just naming a social problem. It's what we choose to say about it and how we say it. With regards to forms of sexual exploitation and suffering framed as trafficking and modern slavery, the frame focuses attention on individuals who are involved in the crime. Generally, the focus is on victims and perpetrators who are identified by law enforcement and victim protection. The ability of society to combat. Before we start, so trafficking is often described as an offence that involves the recruitment, organisation and arrangement of people, the movement of people from one place to another, generally in conditions of exploitation that involve force, coercion, threats, deceit and abuse of power and abuse of the vulnerable situations of particular individuals. So all of these elements need to be present for an act to constitute trafficking. So there's a difference between trafficking and forms of sort of simple labour exploitation that may fall foul of the country's employment law, such as underpaying or not paying people the minimum wage, for example. So not every case of rape or child abuse and not every case of labour exploitation, including that of sex workers, is construed as a form of trafficking. The act has to be regarded as extreme, and trafficking is regarded as a global problem, and there are increasing pressures, therefore, on the global south countries to demonstrate their commitment to combating trafficking and modern slavery by developing legal regimes to combat it. Now, Jamaica is one such country, and they have faced censure from the US because it's felt that their government hasn't done enough to combat human trafficking. In 2005, the Jamaican government was placed on a Tier 3 list for non-compliance with minimum standards for eliminating trafficking. The ranking put Jamaica at risk of losing much needed foreign aid from the United States as well as from other countries, and also damaged their reputation, which was really important for the tourism industry. So although the Jamaican government has year on year spent substantial amounts of money and resources to address the issue, so spending something like 38 million Jamaican dollars, which is quite a lot of money for such a small country, and training police officers and introducing a special unit of public prosecutions to deal specifically with trafficking and training police officers, it still hovers between Tier 2 and Tier 3. And has never really reached the Tier 1. So while anti-framing and modern slavery has widely been embraced, there are also critiques of it that suggest that there are problems with how it frames trafficking and what is left unsaid in some of those definitions. And one of the things that it kind of really doesn't deal with or grapple with is problems around poverty, which is really constructed as a concept that is unchallenged in anti-trafficking and modern slavery frameworks. And I think really need to think about this if we're thinking about trafficking, is to, Jamaica, for example, is a poor country that's really reliant on tourism to pay back huge debt to the IMF. And that payment amounts to twice what is spent on education and health combined. Poverty rates continue to double. So between 2007 and 2014, it doubled. And my data from interviewees suggest that really their attempts to escape this poverty is really what led them into the sex industry. So my data comes from interviews with police officers, hotel managers and workers, representatives of NGO organisations, tourists as well as 15 adult sex workers who participated in a focus group interview and workshop, and these included female, male and trans workers. We also conducted in-depth biographical interviews with current sex workers and 20 people who were involved in various ways in different forms of sexual economic exchanges under the age of 18. Sometimes this involved physical violence, rape. Other times it was trading sex for material benefits. So although the data is small, it does provide some insights into how local people frame dominant discourses on trafficking and modern slavery. Sex work is criminalised in Jamaica, and the research found that police officers often use physical violence against them or rape them or demand sexual favours or extort money from them. In fact, the police were a main source of violence and sexual violence that sex workers experienced. Male and trans sex workers were doubly stigmatised and could expect no protection from the police or, in fact, members of the public as well. So all our male sex workers reported having been subjected to very terrifying ordeals of gang rape by individuals posing as customers. The violence experience was not employed to induce them to sell sexual services, as they were quite willing to do this. Rather, it was to force them into particular types of non-consensual sexual acts. And they were rape victims, not trafficking victims, as described by the UN protocol. However, because of the fraught relationship they had with the police, they were unable to access justice or protection because they were criminalised first as prostitutes, and then in the case of male interviewees, also because of their homosexuality or trans identity. So they didn't dare report the crimes perpetrated against them. And indeed, in interviews with police officers, and in particular 2 very senior police officers, we found that our interviewees were right not to turn to the police for help, because their response to being told about some of the experiences of rape that some of our interviewees had said they'd experienced, they kind of simply stated that, prostitutes cannot be raped, as entering into prostitution is a crime in itself. Police officers were not the only sort of risk element that sex workers encountered. Clients and the general public were openly hostile and violent towards sex workers and towards male and trans sex workers in particular. All the adult sex workers we interviewed had experienced serious violations of civil rights, human rights, and none were constructed as a victim of severe forms of trafficking. In fact, the focus on trafficking made the situation worse by adding stigma to sex work and introducing even more punitive police clampdowns. All 8 of the adult and male trans sex workers in our focus groups started work under the age of 18. Some had also been reported as being missing or trafficked by their families when they had run away. And yet, when you look at their biographical narrative, what emerges is the way that homophobia, bullying and violence and rejection encouraged them to run away and leave the community that they were born in. So there was this real mismatch between the way that home is described in some of the trafficking discourses and sex work is described. There's this kind of real binary and opposition going on, where home is set up as a place that is safe and sex work is a place that is dangerous. But in fact, we found the opposite was true for many of our participants, if not all of them. Many were thrown out by parents or guardians, had grown up in families that were very homophobic, in communities that were very homophobic, and had been beaten up and experienced various forms of violence. And when they ran away, sometimes at the age of 13, they found that because they were so young, they couldn't get jobs, and they turned to sex work as a means of survival. Often sex work was preferable to being looked after by an older adult who would expect particular types of sexual access to them. Working in the sex industry, however, meant that young men could support themselves independently and not be oppressed or kind of have to go into abusive relationships. We found that the queer community in Jamaica was very important to young gay and trans runaways who'd been expelled from home. They provided a place of acceptance in terms of friendship, care and support. And as one young man said, we see each other as a family. Another explained, that they would create households where each would be given a role, like as a house mother, a brother and sister. And this small community really supported them. We had stories of sex workers taking young runaways home and looking after them for 3 or 4 years without expecting any money in exchange, and often giving them, the option to do sex work if they wanted to. But as this quote by Sugar here says, it was an option. No one was forcing her to do it. And actually, she felt it was a good decision when she did enter it because it allowed her to go back to school. Interviewees also experienced violence while working in sex work as children. And again, violence came from individuals who were members of the public or customers or the police. Because both prostitution and homosexuality is criminalised, children who present as gay or as sex workers also experience violence while working in the sex industry. All but one of our interviewees who became involved in commercial sex as children were not controlled by any third party or pushed into sex work, which is what many of the NGOs, such as Shared Hope International, a Jamaican NGO, suggests is happening. This discourse really overlooks the reality of the supply side. Our interviewees were not enticed away from happy homes where they were looked after into a life of hopelessness and abuse and violence. In fact, our interviewees really challenged this stereotype assumed in anti-trafficking and modern slavery discourses. I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the heterosexual men that we talked. We interviewed 6 men who identified as heterosexual but did not self-identify as sex workers, even though they had had various forms of informal sort of sexual economic strategies when they ran away from home as young teenagers. One wasn't even a teenager, he was 10. But so they made their way to tourist areas, and sex work was just one of a range of different things open to them, from selling trinkets, marijuana and jewellery. So through the lens of trafficking and modern slavery discourses, running away made them vulnerable to trafficking. Yet in all of their discourses, they explained how they had suffered abuse and neglect and labour exploitation at home, and that home hadn't been a safe place. They had to work from the age of 5 or 6, often looking after children, cleaning homes, helping to grow food, working in small holdings or working in plantations as a family unit. For many, running away was a good decision, and in the words of one interviewee, I ran away, I went the wrong road, but actually it was the right road. One interviewee in particular, who was 43, ran away to the beach aged 13, and his story lets us unpick some of the intersections between race, gender and sexuality that came to the fore through his economic sexual relationships with tourist women. He was a very handsome man, and he said that he was educated on the beach. His mother had migrated and left him behind, and his dad, who was too poor to care for him and also really just too neglectful to look after him. And he narrated his experience on the beach as one that was quite positive. He explained that part of this positive experience was linked to his interactions with lighter-skinned people and white people. He said that light-skinned people had helped him. He said that it felt great to be seen as someone who was beautiful, in particular by white people. He liked the idea that he was called Michael Jordan. He liked the idea that people thought he was a star. And he felt that white people saw things in him that Jamaicans didn't see. And we can see from this that his narrative about his engagement in the informal sex industry around tourism impacted on his racial perspective of himself, but it also tied him to particular stereotypes about black male sexuality. The majority of the relationships he had were with white tourist women, and again here there's very little focus on white women in particular being perpetrators of trafficking or sexual abuse and exploitation. And with hindsight, he did acknowledge that he had been raped and that tourist women never really saw him as a child because he didn't really have a frame to see himself as a child either. He was black boy who had started work very young and, in the home from the ages of 5, 6, 7. He was tall and part of his masculinity was about sort of presenting as being sexual. He was not forced into relationships with tourist women, and they offered him a way of surviving. But more importantly, his racialized and gendered identity meant that he didn't have a frame to construct them as a form of abuse or a form of sexual exploitation. And this is the case in Jamaica more generally. And Jamaican anti-trafficking frame is focused on young girls and women, not the hypersexual black Jamaican male. And I think this was a real issue for him for coming to terms with what had happened to him. To conclude then, we can see that there is a lot of ambiguity around many of the sexual economic relationships our interviewees entered into. They helped them survive, but also some of them were very painful experiences of sexual violence and sexual exploitation. Yet our data suggests that the distinction that trafficking binaries make between home as being a safe place where children receive protection and nourishment, where they're cared for, and sex work being an exploitative space where they're harmed isn't necessarily true. The binaries as well about sex work always leading to enslavement and not being in sex work being a form of freedom also is a rather oversimplistic opposition. The narratives from local heterosexual men who entered into informal tourist-related encounters as teenagers and from gay and trans workers, sex workers, tell us much about the power relations that shape what counts as sexual violence for the victim as well as the perpetrator. They are ambiguous. Yes, they did experience sexual violence, but maybe not any more than they would have at home. So these are really messy and complicated and draw attention to the global power relations that are racialized, gendered and sexualized and embedded in socioeconomic structures. Sexual encounters on the beach really challenge the way that child sex tourism is constructed in much of the anti-trafficking discourses, where sexual norms are often essentialized. Overall, though, our participants felt that they had some agency in making a choice about not living in poverty and a choice about how they constructed their identity. Yet, the anti-trafficking policy really demonises those who turn to sex work, and this perhaps is the real form of sexual violence. Thank you.